This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, kicks off today's show discussing a court case that involves trespassing, nuisance, right to farm, and road ditch right-of-way laws, and what the court's decision means for farmers. Continuing the show is K-State's Robin Reid, Jenny Ifft, and Kiran Elam talking about the updated hay inventory calculator. They explain the new tools and how they can be utilized. The Beef Cattle Institute's Brad White, Dustin Pendell, and Phillip Lancaster with guest Paige Schmidt in today's show by talking about acute interstitial pneumonia from the recent Cattle Chat podcast. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show talking with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen on a case that involves trespass, nuisance, and right to farm laws. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
Roger, can you give us some background on this case that involves these different issues?
Well, this is a big case, perhaps the most egregious nuisance case that I've ever seen in Kansas, certainly the most egregious one that's hit the Kansas Supreme Court now. And it's out in north-central Kansas, northwest Kansas, kind of west-central, near the Nebraska line. And what you had here was an individual that owned multiple farming operations and put in about 2 miles of pipeline in the road ditch right-of-way next to a public road to transport the liquefied hog waste from this confinement hog operation they'd put in. And he's got a massive amount of manure that they produce, and he put those lines in to transport that liquefied hog waste to spread on his crop fields down the road a ways so that he could hook into his pivot irrigation arms. And so what he did was install 3 underground pipes, 2 that ran water to his hog operation and 1 that would carry the manure back, without the consent of the adjacent landowners, who were the plaintiffs in this case. And he also didn't follow applicable county permitting processes, and his daughter-in-law later filled out a permit application and paid the fee for putting the pipes in, but neither the county clerk nor the road and bridge supervisor ever signed the permit application. And he also created an impression with the county commissioners that he had the permission of the landowners adjacent to the roadway where he was going to install those pipes, but he didn't. And the county attorney came and told the commissioners that the adjacent landowners had to consent before the application could be approved because they actually owned the ditch right-of-way, and you have to have their permission to use their property. And that's what the county attorney properly advised the county commissioners of. But the fact remained, Shelby, that the commission never granted approval for him to install the pipes, and the county attorney then called the sheriff, who temporarily stopped the installation of those pipes, but he went ahead and ignored that. He completed the installation, and the sheriff then contacted the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. But KDHE said, well, wait a minute, this isn't our job. They regulate the disposal of hog waste, but they passed on this particular issue with respect to the pipes. Their issue is, how is it being applied? And does that conform with state regulation? And they said they weren't there yet, so they passed on the issue. But he consistently maintained that he didn't need permission to install the pipes in the road ditch right-of-way, and he went ahead and tried to lobby the county commissioners as well as the Kansas legislature for the express authority to put those pipelines in. He wasn't successful at that, but he tried. But those pipes went for a mile long along the plaintiff's road frontages, and the liquefied manure, then he did actually get it done, and it sprayed from a pivot irrigation system by virtue of an end gun on the pivot near a home of one of the plaintiffs who were also farmers, and that created quite a problem for them, and they sued for trespass and nuisance.
And this went through many different levels of court, starting at the trial court, and what came from there?
Well, he lost at the trial court level, and the trial court level said that what you did was you created a nuisance. You can't use the right to farm law because you were creating a trespass at the time because you didn't get permission to use those road ditch right-of-ways, and the landowners own the road ditch right-of-way. So there is a rule in the Kansas right to farm law that says you have to be in compliance with all state and federal law to be able to be deemed to be operating your farming operation in accordance with good farming practices, which is a requirement of the right to farm law to get the protections from being sued as a nuisance. And so they said, you can be sued as a nuisance. You were a nuisance. They successfully asserted that. You can't block it with the right to farm law. And basically he was wrong on every single point, to sum it up. A very long, tortured set of facts here, but he lost on every single point at the trial court.
And Roger, can you remind us of some of those rules really that go around the road ditch right-of-way?
Well, the case went on appeal, and that's where the courts really dug into the road ditch right-of-way issue. And at the Court of Appeals, a very detailed opinion, and we'd known this was the case based on case law, but the Court of Appeals really elaborated on it. And they said that a road ditch right-of-way can't be used for private purposes without first getting adjacent landowners' permission or getting local or legislative authority, because that right-of-way is owned by the adjacent property owners. They are the fee owner of that road ditch right-of-way, and the public merely has an easement to use the roadway for travel, and that's it. But you own the subsurface to the midpoint of the road, is what the appellate court was saying. They said, just to give you a quote, they said, everything connected with the land over which the road is laid out, end quote, does not pass to the public. It stays with the owner of the underlying and adjacent land. So he couldn't lay his pipes in the road ditch right-of-way without their permission. That's a trespass. And because that was a trespass, then that prevents him from using the state right to farm law as a defensive tactic to prevent being sued successfully for nuisance.
Did this defendant try to use his operation of what he was supplying as a public purpose so that it was okay?
Yeah, and that's a key point here. You can use a road ditch right-of-way if there is a public benefit to it, a public purpose. So, for example, a telephone company can put a telephone wire in the road ditch right-of-way. They can bury a wire for that. A cable company can put a cable TV cable, bury that in the road ditch right-of-way. That's got a public purpose to it. His argument here was that the production of pork benefits consumers. And so there is a public benefit to that. The court didn't buy that at all. They said, no, you're putting this in here to get rid of that manure, which benefits you privately. There is no public purpose to that. So that was quite a stretch of an argument. I guess you have to give him a lollipop for a good try on that. But no, the court was pretty clear that you were doing this solely for your own private purpose to benefit your hog operation. There was no public benefit to that and no public purpose to it. Therefore, you have to have permission to be able to do this, and the county can't give you a permit anyway because they can't authorize you to do something in that ditch right-of-way that state law doesn't allow. And once it's determined that the adjacent landowners own the road ditch right-of-way, then that's up to the adjacent landowners to allow you to do that. The county has nothing to do with that. They can't allow that public easement to be expanded any more than state law allows it. And since there was no public purpose, the county had no role in it.
Roger, made this all the way to the Kansas Supreme Court, and what did they say?
They affirmed the Court of Appeals on every single point. They determined that the plaintiffs did have standing to sue for trespass because they owned the fee interest to the road subsurface that he interfered with, and so that was the first thing that he challenged. They said, well, they can't sue because they don't have an interest. And the court said, well, yeah, they are the fee simple owners of the land that you violated without their permission. So, yes, they are personally affected by this. They do have a standing to sue, and that you committed a trespass, is what they said in affirming the appellate court. And so when he buried the pipelines in the subsurface area of the county road, that's in the scope of the highway easement, which can only be used for a public purpose. And so without permission, he can't do that, and he didn't get permission to do that. And the court said, again, that the county has no authority to authorize any use of the highway easement that exceeded its scope and encumbered one of those adjacent landowners' private property rights. They also said he couldn't get summary judgment on their nuisance claim because the state right to farm law didn't apply because he was not in compliance with all state and federal laws and regulations by virtue of him committing a trespass. Now, what he tried to argue was, well, trespass is a common law provision. It's not part of statutory law, so therefore I am in compliance with all state law. And the court didn't buy that one either. The common law is part of the law of Kansas. Common law meaning judicial-made law. It's made by the courts. It's not statutory. But we have a lot of body of law in Kansas and in other states and in this country that's in the common law. And that's what the legislature meant when they said you have to be in compliance with all state and federal laws. And so that argument failed, too. So he lost on every single point, and the trial court decision was affirmed, and the jury at the trial court returned a verdict of $126,720 in property damages for the plaintiffs, plus $2,000 in nuisance damages, plus $50,000 of punitive damages. And so that jury verdict was upheld.
Roger, what does this mean for farmers?
Well, we do have a right to farm law, and that right to farm law is still quite valid. This case has nothing to do with wiping out any part of the right to farm law, and that says that if you're conducting your farming operation in conformance with all state and federal rules, you get a presumption that you're using best farming practices, best management practices, and if you were there before the person that's complaining about your operation, then you cannot be sued successfully for nuisance. You're not a nuisance. Somebody else moved to the area and started complaining about it, and there's even rules that allow you to expand the size of your operation and still get the protection of the statute in certain circumstances. So that's correct, and it's also correct that you have to be in compliance with all of those laws, and the common law is part of Kansas law. And if you're committing a trespass like this, you can't hide behind the right to farm law to allow you to continue your operation. The other key point coming out of this is landowners, adjacent landowners to a road, own the ditch right away, and you have control over that, over somebody that wants to use it purely for their private purposes. So it's good opinion across the board upholding property rights of rural landowners.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information on this case.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. I will put a link in today's show notes on agtoday.net where you can read more on this blog article. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about a tool on AgManager.info called the Hay Inventory Calculator with K-State Extension farm economist Robin Reid, Flinchbaugh Agricultural Policy Chair at K-State Jenny Ifft, and an undergrad in agricultural economics at K-State, Kiran Elam. Robin, as we're talking about this Hay Inventory Calculator, can you first give us some background and history to what made this calculator come to fruition?
So this tool has actually been out on our website, AgManager.info, for quite a few years. And really it came about because I had a question from a producer. How much hay do I need to have on hand going into the winter to feed my cattle, and how much excess do I have that I can sell? So fundamentally seems like a pretty easy question, but really when you look at it, there's, a lot of things that you have to consider when you're looking at your cow herd. How much hay are they going to eat in their third trimester of pregnancy? And then how much is that going to increase when they calve, say in January, February, or whenever, when they're still in the lot, most typically. So looking at all those different factors, what are the hay needs of that cow herd? And then if the bales are already on hand, obviously you have a good count and possibly a weight on those bales. But if you still have some out in the field, say it's earlier in the summer and you're trying to make these decisions, then you got to factor in, how much your forage is going to be per acre in yield and how many bales you'll get out of that. And then, match those two things up, inventory and needs, and what do you have left that you can sell.
How was this tool different from the original tool?
Well, the original tool itself was really used quite a bit when we went through the drought times the last couple of years, because obviously forages were extremely expensive and having extra inventory on hand was hard. For one, there just wasn't much of it out there, but by keeping that forage an additional year, that was pricey inventory to have, and the quality discount you got the following year and hay prices coming down really made this a tough decision on whether you sell or whether you hold excess inventory. The one shortcoming of the tool and why Jenny and Kiran have worked on it is in the original tool, it's pretty basic, and hay is hay, meaning if you had brome or prairie hay or even alfalfa in inventory, it just treated that as tonnage. It didn't consider any of the quality aspects of it. So that's where the improvement has come in on this tool.
Jenny, Kiran, what upgrades and improvements have you made?
So one thing that we did is I took the tool that Robin had made and turned it into a web-based tool. So you can just follow the link and you don't have to have Excel or get on your laptop or anything like that. And so it's pretty similar to what Robin has done on that web-based tool. But then we also made in what we call the advanced calculator, which is still in Excel. It's a spreadsheet, but it has some additional things, like it takes into account whether you have brome or you have alfalfa and some other things like that.
And something really important for thinking about forage insurance and integrating into a risk management plan, possibly, Jenny?
Right. So most of my work on the extension side is in crop insurance and livestock insurance. And I've done a lot of talks on forage insurance, trying to explain it as clearly as possible. One of the challenges, though, is if people want to use it for risk management, you have to think about how they're managing risk with forage. And inventories are a key way to manage risk. And so that's why we wanted to bring this tool to producers, meet them where they're at. If they want to start out with something, do a quick calculation. There's a spreadsheet, or you can get online. It even should work on your phone to see where you're at. If you want to dig a little deeper, you can go into the advanced spreadsheet. We worked with John Holman, who's an agronomist, and he advised us to add in crude protein, saying that's it's not a feed ration calculator, but that's an important thing to know with your hay. So we added that in as well. So, trying to help people with those broader management decisions.
And thinking of those broader management decisions, taking into account of maybe how I should handle my hay now because we don't know what the hay market's going to do.
Yeah. So, really what the calculator fundamentally is telling you is how much excess or how much shortage you have in your current inventory. And, as cattle producers right now, we have some record profitability in the cattle markets because of some lower input costs and obviously some higher cattle prices. So, maybe it's not as big of an issue as it was in the last few years of drought, but there's still a lot of drought going across our state, and our forage inventories have loosened up a little bit, so we're not managing quite as tightly. But still the fundamental question is how much hay do we need to have for this upcoming season? And I know we were talking before the broadcast here just how much hay you see sitting in fields yet that it might be 1 or 2 years old. And there is a real cost to letting that inventory sit. Obviously you need some excess, but maybe we're keeping too much that should be marketed and not have that quality discount or risk of prices dropping when we have more excess forage.
And so the advanced calculator you can add in feed loss, and you can do it by type of hay or by field. So if a producer, has a lot of older hay, they can go in and get a really precise estimate of how far that's going to take them.
And Jenny, I think one thing too we might add is the advanced calculator can also take into account silage,
yes,
which is a big difference from the original tool.
We added silage in because it's a lot different. It's stored differently than hay. It's fed differently than hay. It has a different moisture content than hay. And so when you're calculating that, your moisture content for silage is so much higher. When you're considering how much you need to feed your livestock, it can really be a lot different than hay. So if you have silage with the old tool, you couldn't really account for that moisture difference.
And another tab within this tool is the definition and suggestions tab. And what could people find underneath that?
So I added a definitions and suggestions tab to the web-based tool so that it's a little easier. Maybe if you're a new producer, if it's something kind of new to you, you're not really sure of things like what does moisture content percentage mean, or what does DMI mean as your dry matter intake. It's kind of just a guide to help people walk through that web-based tool. So hopefully we can make it as easy as possible and as user-friendly as possible.
And I would add to that, one thing that's really educational about this tool is it takes into account storage loss and feeding loss on your forages. I think that is something a lot of times we don't think about. And depending how you're feeding it, if you're just throwing them out in round bale feeders, there's a real loss to when those cattle are trampling and sorting through that forage. Or in the storage side, if those round bales are just outside, maybe they're in pyramids or, different situations, they are going to have forage losses. So this calculator, as she said in the definitions tabs, gives you suggested amounts to account for those losses.
What different livestock producers could use this tool?
It is focused towards cattle because I'm sure that's what a lot of our producers see, but we do have a category for other livestock. If you have sheep, if you have goats, if you have horses, you can also use those the same calculations. There's an other livestock tab for...
As long as the calculations are relevant, you could use it for anything, your alpacas or whatever.
So as you're talking about, this tool can be used as an Excel or web-based calculator. And are there a few differences of how producers could use it and maybe save that information?
There are definitely differences. So Excel, obviously, like you can save that information. If you put in your numbers and you go back to it, you don't remember what your surplus or your deficit was, you can go back to it. However, on the web-based tool, say you're out in the field, you're doing it on your phone, if you do not save that information, write it down, screenshot it, whatever you're doing, you're not going to return to that information. If you exit out of the web-based tool, it won't be there when you click on the link again. So make sure that if you are using the web-based tool to write down the numbers that you received after the calculator.
Your team has obviously made some improvements to the hay inventory calculator, and like many tools on AgManager.info, they're to serve Kansas producers. So if those producers do have some feedback, would you like to hear about it?
Definitely. That's why we do this. These tools are out there to help people. So we have the spreadsheet, we have the web-based version, there's tutorial videos out there, trying to help people with whatever level they want to use our tools at. So we, definitely need to get that feedback to keep improving these tools and make sure they're useful.
And I would add to that, all of the tools we have on Ag Manager have came about because somebody asked us a question that needed a calculator to solve, because if you look at the variability of our producers across the state, obviously eastern Kansas and western Kansas are two very different environments. But at the same time, just the production practices and things like that between our agricultural operations, it really makes some of these questions not a one and done decision. It really needs to take different factors into account, and it may come up with a different result depending on different producers. So I would encourage any producer that has a question to come to us in Extension here, and maybe the tool, the answer is not a decision tool, but like I said, all of our tools typically came about because somebody asked a question that needed solved. So,
what is the best way for producers to give their feedback?
So if you go to AgManager.info, our contact information is there. There's phone and email information. It all works.
Robin, Jenny, Kieran, I appreciate you all taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That was Flintshire Agricultural Policy Chair at K-State, Jenny Ifft, and she was joined by K-State Extension Farm Economist Robin Reid and K-State undergrad in Agricultural Economics Kiran Elam as they talked about the hay inventory calculator. You can find this calculator by going to AgManager.info, or I will also link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Wednesday show with K-State's Brad White, Phillip Lancaster, Dustin Pendell, and guest Paige Schmidt.
We're able to have Dr. Paige Schmidt here. She's a veterinarian. She graduated this year from veterinary schools, finishing her master's, and she's doing some work on a disease syndrome called Acute Interstitial Pneumonia, and we'll talk about it as AIP here. And it's a little bit different than what we typically think about with bovine respiratory disease. Paige, I know the clinical signs or what we would see in the live animal looks very similar, but what makes interstitial pneumonia different than our typical respiratory disease?
Yeah, one of the main things that is different with acute interstitial pneumonia is that we see a really high case fatality rate for that. So about 50% or greater of these animals that come down with this syndrome end up dying. So it's definitely a detriment, and we don't have a known treatment for this pneumonia.
What are some of the causative factors with this interstitial pneumonia?
That's a great question, and I wish I knew myself. There's a lot of different etiology hypotheses out there on what could cause this pneumonia. So some of those thoughts are dust contribute or an allergic reaction, potentially viruses, pneumotoxins, but we really don't know at this point what causes AIP in feedlot cattle.
So, Paige, how often do we see AIP in feedlot cattle?
Yeah, AIP is a sporadic disease. It can change based off feed yard or region. However, in deads, there's about 8% of mortalities that we see are AIP.
So of all the mortalities, a lot of them would be respiratory disease, so somewhere in the 60% range. And of the remainder, there's about 8% of the total mortalities that would be associated with AIP or acute interstitial pneumonia.
Correct, yep.
And so what are some of the treatments for AIP?
Yeah, we really don't have any treatments for AIP just because we don't know what that causes. So we don't think it's due to bacterial, so therefore antibiotics are not effective. Some people will use steroids because there's a high inflammatory response, but we don't have a true treatment for the disease.
So how do we end up diagnosing AIP? I mean, if you say they look the same when they're alive, we can look at them if they end up dying, and a lot more of the AIPs end up dying than some of our BRD cases. How do you know it's AIP versus BRD?
That can get tricky. It's within the name acute interstitial pneumonia. We tend to see an acute onset of clinical signs, not necessarily saying that this is something that just happened overnight, but when we see it, it tends to be acute. We've done some work here at the BCI looking at using lung ultrasounds, but basically looking at the animal, looking at their stance, frothing at the mouth. They get hypoxic, so they can be aggressive, stand with that wide-based stance. So it's very hard to diagnose and distinguish from BRD, and that's where we can have some discrepancies and some unknowns on if we're diagnosing them right out in the field.
And typically we think rapid onset, as you described, and that hypoxia or lack of oxygen because they're not having a good air exchange, and a large percent of their lung is involved. So with respiratory disease, often it starts at a central location or a specific location and kind of expands, and as it expands, the calf gradually looks worse and worse and worse. With acute interstitial pneumonia, often we see the calf looked pretty good yesterday, and then today they look very diseased. And if we look at those lungs, it's impacting a high percentage of their lungs. So what's next in your research? Because like you said, we don't know exactly what causes it. We don't know exactly what best treatments. So how are you trying to sort that out?
Yeah, so currently I'm doing a retrospective analysis with a large data set that incorporates multiple feed yards across the country, and we're looking at strictly AIP mortalities. And we have two objectives with that. We're looking at arrival demographics of the lots, so sex of the lot, head received, their origin, the region they're fed in, and just trying to see if we can find any risk factors with AIP mortalities, and then also looking at some health demographics that occur in the first 45 days on feed, so we can make some better ideas and maybe manage those lots a little differently if we find any risk factors with that disease.
Excellent. We're looking forward to hearing the outcomes of your research and appreciate you coming to share with us today on this disease that is important because we have a large number of fatalities, but doesn't occur as frequently as some of our other diseases. Thanks, Paige.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.